Welcome back. We're surveying Job and the dialogues that he has with his friends. The first conversation spans chapters 4 through 14. We meet Eliphaz, perhaps the senior of Job's friends, who seems to empathize, and he starts out by carefully commending Job for his ministry to hurting people. Verses 3 and 4. But it doesn't take long for him to get to the bottom line. Who ever heard of the innocent perishing? When did you ever see the upright cut off? And so you see this principle of retribution we talked about taking center stage. Verse 8. As I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same, Job, you reap what you sow. You see, for Eliphaz, there can only be one explanation. Job, somehow, you messed up big time. Just admit it. Look at chapter 5, verse 8. Eliphaz says, if I were you, Job, I'd seek God, and to God I would commit my cause. And then skim down to verse 17 and following. Repent, so God will forgive you. Well, for Job, Eliphaz adds only insult to injury. Look at chapter 6, verse 4. The arrows and the terrors that Job's received from God are quite bad enough, thank you. Job's to the point of despairing of life itself, although he has no sense of how he has sinned against God. Look at chapter 6, verse 8. Oh, that my request might come to pass, that God would grant my longing. Would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. But it's still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain, that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. See, Job not only pushes back against Eliphaz's accusation, but then he turns to God himself in chapter 7, verse 20. If I sin, what do I do to you, watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? Well, enter Bildad in chapter 8, an expert in the direct approach to pastoral care. Look at chapter 8, verse 2. Job, he says, stop being such a windbag. Are you suggesting that God perverts justice? Your kids were killed because they sinned. Well, in chapter 9, Job responds, as best I know my heart, it's right with God. But if not, verse 2, then how can man ever be right before God? You guys are wrong. But I can't exactly take God to court now, can I? Chapter 9, verse 12 through 20. And then in verse 23, you see this age-old conundrum. Why do the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper? So, in chapter 10, verse 2, Job asks God, why? And he concludes this part of the dialogue with the lament of chapter 10, verse 18 and following. Why then have you brought me out of the womb? Would that I had died and no eye had seen me. I should have been as though I had not been, carried from womb to tomb. Would he not let my few days alone? Withdraw from me, that I may have a little cheer, before I go, and I shall not return to the land of darkness and deep shadow, the land of utter gloom as darkness itself, of deep shadow without order, which shines as the darkness. Well, Job's third pastoral counselor, Zophar, joins the conversation in chapter 11 and basically accuses Job of being a blowhard and warns him that God's letting him off easy. Look at chapter 11, verse 6. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. So, Maybe it's not surprising that Job sarcastically replies to all three in chapter 12, verse 2. Each of you thinks that I'm the man, that you're the custodians of wisdom. When you die, so will wisdom. And Job admits that, yes, God does allow the wicked to prosper for a time, 12:6. Then, in chapter 13, Job addresses God directly. He reaffirms that his faith is in Yahweh. Look at chapter 13, verse 15. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. You see, Job's still asking God to convict him where he sinned against God. Verse 20 and following. And this whole cycle concludes with a lament. Chapter 14. Think about it. We'll see you in a bit.